Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing my wrap-up of my monthly priority for September 2020, which was Latinx heritage. It was also the Latinx-a-thon, so as I talk about my wrap-up, I'm going to be relating to the prompts from the Latinx-a-thon. If you're not familiar with my monthly priorities, I will link a playlist about them below, as well as the TBR that I did for Latinx Heritage Month. So basically what I'm going to do in this wrap up is tell you about the books that I finished, as well as talk about some of the themes that I noticed going across many of these different books and recommend a couple of favorites for you. So first, let me tell you which books I finished that were by Latinx authors in September. I ended up reading 11 books that were by Latinx authors, although most of those were picture books and only 2 of them were from my TBR. Also, I want to give a really big shout out to Cecilia L.K, who made a comment in my original TBR letting me know that I had incorrectly assumed that some authors were Latinx when they weren't. I had included a bunch of Caribbean authors, and only some Caribbean islands are part of Latin America, those which have languages that descend from Latin, so things like French, Spanish, or Portuguese. So thank you to Cecilia, which helped me figure out that I needed to switch around some of the things on my TBR, but really, I didn't read hardly anything off my TBR anyway, so I'm just glad that I still enjoyed the month and got a lot of Latinx things read, even if they weren't quite what I planned. So let me go ahead and talk about them. So first, let me talk about the books that I read that satisfied some of the prompts for the Latinx-a-thon. And I have all of the info about the Latinx-a-thon, the hosts, the challenges, all of that linked below in case you're interested. So the first prompt was voices to read a book by a Black or Indigenous Latinx author. And for this, I read Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. This is a poetry collection that I heard about from Jocelyn at Yogi with the Book, one of the hosts of Latinx-a-thon, who I will link below. And it was really good. So Natalie Diaz is Mojave and also Latinx, and she's queer. And this poetry collection is really 2 things. Part of it is the love poem. It is all of these poems that she has written to her lover about kind of the sensuality, and a lot of this is actually really quite graphic in terms of the beauty of their love for each other. There's a lot of very sensual poems in this. The other part of these poems is that a lot of them are really talking about colonialism and about the way that so many Indigenous communities are affected, continue to be affected by colonialism, and about the way that so much of what's important to them, things like water rights, are limited or taken away. So it was a very political collection of poems. It was very beautiful. A lot of it went over my head because it's very good poetry that demands a lot of the reader in terms of imagery and thinking of things, and it was just very impressive. So I really think this was a cool poetry collection to read for this prompt. Next, for prompt 2, Latinidad, to read a book by an intersectional Latinx author, I read Cantoras by Carolina de Robertes. This is a book that is a historical fiction set in mainly the 1970s and 80s in Uruguay about a group of 5 queer women who sort of come together and find a space and a place for them to be themselves. It's a book that I heard about from Andrea at Perpetual Pages, who I will link below, and I just thoroughly loved this book. I did an entire standalone review. I thought it was beautifully written and so powerful and had such good messages. Also, Andrea has a review as well, so I will link that below too. Definitely check that out too. Next, prompt 3, Roots, read a book that is translated or features more than one language by a Latinx author. So for this, I have a couple of books that satisfied it. The first was actually on my TBR, and that is Peluda by Melissa Lozada Oliva. This is another poetry collection that I absolutely loved. This poetry collection is probably my favorite poetry collection that I've read in recent memory. I did an entire standalone review for that, so I will link it below. But basically, it's all about really the author's connection to her Latinx heritage. She is Guatemalan Colombian American, and it's about her connection to her heritage, but also her wanting to fit in with mainstream American culture. It's about a lot of things that define her that are maybe messy or not liked by society. The title of the collection is Peluda, which means like hairy one. And there's so much in this about hairiness and about sort of these aspects of yourself that are part of your heritage but are not very acceptable socially. So there's a lot of fascinating stuff in here. I loved the poetry. It was just so good. So check out my review or check out the poetry collection. It's really good. The other two books that I read that satisfy this prompt are both bilingual children's picture books that I heard about from Priscilla at Bookie Charm. I will link below her channel as well as a video she did with recommendations for Latinx picture books. So the first is Tito Puente, Mambo King by Monica Brown, illustrated by Rafael Lopez. And this is a biography all about Tito Puente, who was a Puerto Rican American musician, composer, orchestra conductor. He was just very impressive and did a lot in terms of Latinx music. And this picture book was beautifully illustrated and so much fun, so I really liked it. The other picture book that I read was Grandma's Chocolate by Mara Price, illustrated by Lisa Fields. And this is all about a little girl whose grandmother comes to visit from Mexico and brings a bunch of things in her suitcase that are connected to their indigenous heritage. So ribbons for her hair to put it up in a style that was what Mayan princesses would wear, or making chocolate in the traditional Mayan way. So there was a lot in here just about heritage that was really, really sweet to read about. Then challenge 4 I did not get to, which was heritage, to read a book by a non-Spanish speaking Latin American country author. And I also did not get to the group book, so unfortunately I didn't finish those challenges, but I did read quite a few other things, mainly picture books, that were Latinx, so let me tell you about those too. So I'll start with the picture books, beginning with All the Way to Havana by Margarita Engel, illustrated by Mike Curato. This is a sweet picture book that is about a family in Cuba who is going from the countryside to the city driving in their old car. And if you're not familiar with it because of all of the embargoes, Cuba has a lot of old vehicles from the 50s that, because they weren't able to get new cars, people have been very ingenious about maintaining and getting to work. And so this is a little bit of a love story to those cars. It's very sweet. Another picture book that I read and absolutely loved was Dreamers by Yuyi Morales. This is sort of a memoir of Yuyi Morales' journey from Mexico to the US with her young infant baby, and about kind of adapting to life in the US and really finding the libraries and picture books and just falling in love with reading picture books at the library. It's just this beautiful ode to libraries and love of books, and it's got such fascinating, beautiful illustrations with so many different textures. I loved the drawing style, and it was just really sweet. Next, I read Frida Kahlo and Her Animalitos by Monica Brown, illustrated by John Parra. This is a little sweet biography of Frida Kahlo, talking about her life, but especially focusing on all of the animals. She had so many different animals throughout her life. Monkeys and birds and dogs and cats and so many different things. And so it's really about her life and all of the difficulties she went through. She had a lot of health issues, but also just focusing on her art and her animals. It was very, very sweet, and I loved the illustrations. And the last picture book that I read was Planting Stories by Annika Aldemui Denise, illustrated by Paula Escobar. This is another biography, this time of Pura Belpré, who was a Puerto Rican woman who moved to New York and started working for the New York City Library, bringing in a lot of Spanish language books, and especially started writing her own versions of many Puerto Rican kind of stories and histories and myths, lots of fairy tales, bringing that in. So it was another really sweet story. It had absolutely lovely drawings as well. Then I finished 2 other books this month that were by a Latinx author, which is Silvia Moreno-Garcia. So the first is Prime Meridian, which is a sci-fi novella about a woman who wants to go to the colonies on Mars, but is stuck in kind of poverty and a lot of failed life ambitions. And it's got a lot of bitterness to it, but also a lot of feminist power. And I think it's a take on cyberpunk. I did an entire standalone review of this, which I will link below, but I think this book had a ton to say, and I really got a lot out of it. The other book by Silvia Moreno-Garcia that I read this month was Mexican Gothic, which is another one that I did a standalone review for, so I will link that below. But this is Moreno-Garcia's take on the Gothic novel set in Mexico in the 1950s, and it is so atmospheric and very, very creepy, at least for me. And it has, again, a lot of really interesting themes of feminism, of gaslighting, of eugenics, and it follows such a cool character, Noemi, who is this socialite in Mexico City who goes to this crumbling Victorian mansion in the mountains to check on her cousin, Catalina, who got married and has been having some issues. This house is definitely a creepy one, so it's perfect for this season if you're interested. So those are all of the books that I've read. Now I want to talk about the themes that I saw emerge across all of these different books by Latinx authors. The first theme that I really noticed was that of dreaming big. A lot of these stories had people in them who were dreaming of something very, very big and worked to make that happen. In Dreamers, we have Yuyi Morales' story of coming to the US and not speaking English, but finding the world of books and how that opened up her dreams and made her want to become an author. It was absolutely beautiful. We had Tito Puente, which is all about this Mambo King, this guy who had all of these dreams about being huge in the music scene. And he did, and he not only wrote his own music, but he became an orchestra conductor. He did such a ton of things. He dreamt very, very large. We have Cantoras, which is this story about 5 queer women who were living in a time in Uruguay where the dictatorship very much did not allow them to be themselves, dreaming of finding themselves, dreaming of a place where they could be free, where they could express themselves without fear. They had these huge dreams of just self-realization. And in Prime Meridian, we have a girl who is just so dissatisfied by the littleness, the smallness, the grittiness of her everyday life and dreams of going to the colony on Mars, and is unwilling to give up those huge dreams, no matter how unrealistic they may seem. Another theme I noticed was a strong connection to heritage. This came up in many of the books. In Grandma's Chocolate, the whole book really is about the grandmother conveying so much of their heritage and their history to her granddaughter, and the granddaughter connecting so strongly to their indigenous history. In Planting Stories, Pura Belpré, the New York City librarian, found that there were no stories from Puerto Rico, and that was so important to her that she decided she had to write them, and she would even perform them for the kids. And just connecting to her own heritage and her own history and saying, these are the stories that I want to pass down. In Post-Colonial Love Poem, so much of this is Natalie Diaz really connecting to her indigenous culture and to what matters. And what matters is so much the connection to water. There's so much in here about how the history of her people and the beliefs of her people is all about the water and all about how they are the water. And there's just so much in here that's really, really beautiful about that connection and that heritage. In Peluda, which is just so much about the author trying to understand what her heritage is and how she's connected to it, and how that is something that she should value while at the same time dealing with the frustration of not fitting in. So there's this push and pull between wanting to somehow not be defined by your heritage, but also finding the value in her heritage. And she has some really good poems in there, especially about connection to Spanish, to her heritage language. I really, really loved the way that that was explored. And lastly, a theme that I noticed across so many of these books is self-empowerment. So many of these stories are just about people deciding to empower themselves, not waiting for anybody else, not allowing anybody else to tell them that they can't be, but just grabbing that empowerment for themselves. In All the Way to Havana, which is this story about this kind of ingenuity of people making these cars work long past the point when they should have stopped, that's just deciding it doesn't matter if we can't get new cars, we're gonna make this work. We're gonna make this be what we need it to be. In Frida Kahlo and her Animalitos, this again is about a woman who faced huge issues in her life. She went through polio and a huge accident that made her lay in bed for such a long time, and she said, I'm gonna start painting while I'm here. And she went through a lot of tragedies in her life, and she used that art to empower herself. In Cantoras, there is just, again, this story of 5 women who come together and who say, even if this dictatorship doesn't allow us freedom, we're gonna find that freedom for ourselves. We're gonna find space, find meaning, find community, and empower ourselves. In Prime Meridian, the main character who wants to go to Mars, again, everything in life is against her, and everyone around her is constantly telling her, why don't you just fall in line? Why don't you just do what you're supposed to do, accept that you'll never be able to do anything else, and give up on your dreams and live a kind of a very sad little life? And she says, no, I'm gonna find a way. I'm gonna keep doing me, and she empowers herself. And lastly, Mexican Gothic, similarly, there's so much in here about women who are dealing with a system and with people around them who are trying to disempower them and refusing to let that happen, and saying, you know, you can't convince me that I don't have power because I know that I do. So I loved that theme. And I did focus on Latinx reads last year as well, so I just wanted to compare some of the themes that I saw. So last year, the themes that I noticed were food, which definitely was present again, family, I have yet to read like a Latinx story that doesn't focus on family, and responsibility. Again, responsibility is something that I saw a lot too, the weight of that responsibility. So I saw all of those themes again, as well as these new ones. Okay, so lastly, I wanted to go ahead and recommend a couple of my favorite reads from this month. If you don't have time to read all of the books that I mentioned, here are 3 that I think are particularly worth your while. The first is Peluda by Melissa Lozada Oliva. I think that this poetry collection is just so powerful and has such interesting themes and is really funny, and it's just so well done. I have an entire standalone review, which I will link below, talking in more detail about why I loved it. But if you like poetry, if you especially like poetry about identity, I think this is very much worth picking up. Next, I'd like to recommend Cantoras by Carolina de Robertes. This is another one that I have a standalone review for, so I will link that below. But this book is just so gorgeously written. The writing is absolutely stunning. The historical setting is so interesting and so fascinating, and the empowerment of these queer women is such a moving story. I think if you like literary fiction, this is definitely one to pick up. And lastly, I'd like to recommend Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Again, I have a standalone review for this, so I will link it below. But this is something that I think is so creepy and atmospheric, and is such an interesting take on the Gothic genre, with very much a feminist bent that discusses a lot of issues of gaslighting and eugenics and colonialism. So it's got a ton of meat to the story, a lot of interesting topics and themes, and I just love the main character and I had such a good time reading this one. So that wraps up my Latinx Heritage Reading Month from September. If you guys have read any of these books, if you have any thoughts, any comments, any recommendations, anything at all, go ahead, leave me a comment down below.